So burnout today is on the rise. It's a global phenomenon as over half of American workers report extended periods of burnout and nearly half of the world. Burnout is not conventionally something similar to stress. As a matter of fact, burnout is something that's exclusively occupational. There's no such thing as social burnout or relational burnout. It is a purely work-based experience. But burnout itself isn't purely fatigue. As a matter of fact, it actually impacts your physical body along with your spiritual vitality and ability to apprehend truth and live in alignment with truth by making high quality decisions in a reasonable amount of time. And there are so many different perspectives on how to manage burnout in today's day and age. People saying that it's the individual's responsibility only. Some people saying that it's corporations and the government's job to deal with burnout from a structural and legal perspective. But at the end of the day, even the middle ground that tries to harmonize the best of both of those extreme perspectives completely misses something very important. 99% of burnout management issues require people to prioritize self-preservation. And while on a surface level, this seems like a logical, intuitive, good idea, it actually hardens our vitality even more than it already is in seasons of extended burnout. In reality, sacrifice is the key to dealing with burnout that changes the way we think about our work in such a way that we're able to deal with burnout more effectively. And on today's episode, I can make you 4 promises. You'll come out of this episode with 2 accounts, a historical and a scientific account of just what exactly burnout is, how our perspective on it has progressed over time, and how science indicates the physical impact of burnout on the human body. You'll come out with 4 perspectives, one extreme perspective, another common extreme perspective, a messy middle ground perspective, and an elevated perspective that brings our vitality above the noise so that we can effectively deal with burnout in a sustainable manner. You'll come out with 1 reframing as we not only shape our perspective on burnout again, but also shape our perspective on engagement again and to practically put ourselves within the workplace in a different disposition. And at the end of today's episode, I'll leave you with 28 vitality check questions that you and those who you hold dear can use to honestly evaluate the places that you're struggling to manage burnout so that you can bring specific requests before the God of the universe in prayer and see him transform you over time into a person who not only can effectively manage burnout, but can be actively engaged in their workplace. Welcome to the Vitality Principle, where on this podcast, I lead a deconstruction and reconstruction of the human disposition on the grounds of comprehensive truth evaluation. The notification chime sounded like a dull thud inside of Sarah's chest. It was 10:14 p.m. Her laptop screen cast a cool blue light across the cluttered dining room table, where coffee mugs had stacked up like little monuments to the last 3 days. The email was from her director, flagged with a red exclamation point, titled "Quick Review on the Q3 decks before tomorrow?" 8 months ago, that red flag would have triggered a lightning bolt of nervous energy. She would have snapped quickly into action, brewed another cup, and driven herself to finish the deck by 2 a.m., fueled by an intense, anxious need to deliver. Tonight, there was no lightning bolt. There was no spike of heart rate, no sudden burst of panic, no urgency. There was only a vast empty room where her care used to live. Sarah stared at her reflection in the dark frame of the screen. She remembered her first year on the job, back when work felt like a back-and-forth rhythm. You'd push hard on a project, cross the finish line, celebrate with the team, and breathe. But somewhere along the line, the finish line had been removed. Every time the team found a way to work faster, the baseline simply shifted. The reward for doing good work was simply more work, coming at machine speed, requiring her to constantly audit, manage, and validate an endless stream of incoming tasks. She moved her mouse over the email icon. Her finger hovered over the trackpad. In her head, she tried to summon the usual arguments. It'll only take 45 minutes. It's just better to get it over with so you don't have to worry about it tomorrow. You don't want people thinking you've lost your edge. But as she tried to force her hands onto the keyboard, her body simply refused. It wasn't an act of defiant rebellion. It was a total power outage. The fuel tank wasn't low. The floor had dropped out of the bottom. Sarah closed the laptop lid. The mechanical click echoed loudly in the quiet apartment. She stood up, her joints stiff, and walked around the hallway to the bathroom. She turned on the faucet, splashed cold water on her face, and picked up a towel. Looking in the mirror, she noticed how tight her shoulders were, pulled up almost to her ears, like a shield she had forgotten to take off. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Another ping, then another. Slowly, Sarah reached into her pocket, pulled out the phone, and held down the power button. She watched the screen go dark, screen side down on the counter. The pitch tomorrow morning was going to be uncomfortable. There would be questions. There might even be disappointed looks in the morning meeting. The system she worked in hadn't changed, and the demands weren't going to vanish overnight. But as she walked into her dark bedroom and pulled back the covers, Sarah realized something crucial. She couldn't keep sacrificing her health to maintain the illusion that an impossible workload was sustainable. She laid her head down on the pillow, closed her eyes, and for the first time in almost a year, let the silence take over. And so you might not have experienced Sarah's exact circumstance, but nonetheless, regardless of the industry you work in, you may or may not have either heard of or directly dealt with burnout itself. Burnout is an absolute issue in today's day and age. Like I said earlier, the fast-paced nature of the American economy in particular naturally produces burnout. Human beings aren't machines. But in order for our system to continue to survive and compete at a global level, society has to continue to produce. And so people just have had more and more pressure put on them over the last several years in particular. And so, quite honestly, burnout is not necessarily a new phenomenon. We're just experiencing it more in the advanced day and age that we currently live within. But historically, if we were to look back over the past 50 years and evaluate the progression of burnout over that period of time, what we'll actually see is a pretty radical transformation in the way that people perceive burnout and its impact on humanity. Initially, in around the 1970s, when the term was first coined, initially, it was termed and coined with respect to people who worked in more social service industries. So if you're to think maybe social work, maybe teachers, nurses, these types of individuals who worked in these specific industries were starting to demonstrate this emotional fatigue. And this concept was quickly termed burnout. But the concept was really only applied to people who were viewed to be idealists. It was these people who worked in these industries who had a very emotionally driven personality. And so, in a large part, the concept of burnout never really was considered to be something experienced by people who worked in the broader economy, maybe in, say, a manufacturing type of job. But over the years, as the American economy shifted out of manufacturing and into more service industries, what we started to notice and what scientists started to notice is that burnout was actually not something that was only experienced by people who worked in these more service type of industries and had a very emotionally driven job and disposition. It was something that was experienced by people everywhere on the social complex and the competitive landscape as well. Everyone from people working in a tech factory to high-level CEOs, everyone was demonstrating burnout. And as a result of this, the concept of burnout was redefined. It was no longer seen as this sort of disease of idealists, and it was more so now seen as something that generally encompassed some kind of exhaustion, some kind of cynicism and detachment from work, and some kind of drop in efficacy or practical productivity in the workplace. Add on to that the massive digital transformation that came in the early 2000s. And the line between work and home life really just eroded, with the development of smartphones, with the development of high-speed internet, portable laptops, people started taking work home. And so, yet again, the concept of burnout was redefined. Burnout was no longer defined with respect to grit or how much work ethic and drive someone necessarily had. And it was more so considered within the context of job demands and resources, meaning that burnout generally was seen to occur more when demand of the job perpetually outweighed the resources and the autonomy that the people involved in the work circumstance were given in order to perform their job well. And then you fast forward to today's day and age. Actually, before then, a few years ago, it's worth noting that the World Health Organization officially labeled burnout itself as an ICD-11, which is not necessarily a formal mental condition or mental illness. Kind of like I said in the introduction, burnout is currently seen not as something that you can experience in the other aspects of your life, like your social life or your relational life. Burnout isn't a thing there. It's a strictly occupational phenomenon. And so from that point in time onward, especially in the post-COVID era, and especially with the emergence of artificial intelligence, burnout just continues to rise, especially in the workplace type of confinement that we've understood it within over the past few years. With the rise of artificial intelligence in particular, what was supposed to make people's jobs easier has actually just given them more work and more complex work to deal with. And so, unfortunately, burnout has been exacerbated by the influence of artificial intelligence in the workplace. Artificial intelligence in its current stage is now mostly being implemented in a lot of sectors to deal with the more tedious tasks that people were originally spending tons of time doing. And that has really meant that people have shifted towards a more supervisory perspective over those tedious tasks and are now tasked with more complex high-level tasks in addition to monitoring AI. And so clearly the workload has increased. And on top of that, the fact that AI is improving productivity in the workplace simply means that the standards are being raised, especially in the competitive global economy, let alone the American economy. The more work that can get done is the simple standard. There is no cap. There is no getting your work done and being done for a period. There is getting your work done and then trying to get more work done on top of that so you can not just keep up with your competition, but stay ahead of your competition. And so, yet again, regardless of the period of time that we're looking at over the last 50 years, it's crystal clear that burnout continues to be a problem that is ever evolving in today's day and age, especially in Western civilization. And so, that said, aside from the historical impact or the progression in perspective on the issue of burnout, it's not just a mental fatigue thing. It's not just something that people can think happy thoughts about instead and deal with in that type of way. It has a very real physical impact on the body. Oftentimes people confuse burnout with chronic stress, and they are not the same thing, not even in the slightest. When someone's dealing with chronic stress, fundamentally, the cortisol dynamics are a little bit different. When you're in a high stress state, this is your brain being super highly flooded with cortisol and excess levels of it to the point where your body is vigilant, it's anxious, and it's just ready to go. It's ready to knock out work and be productive. But when it comes to burnout, there's really not the same impact at all within the brain. And as a matter of fact, burnout is categorized by the brain regulating its own stress response to the point where it's now protecting its tissues from cortisol toxicity. And as a result of this, there's usually significantly low levels of cortisol in the mind of a person, in the brain of a person who is experiencing intense burnout. But we also see impacts on memory function as well as a massive difference between stress and burnout. When someone is experiencing high levels of stress, that high cortisol is impairing the synaptic plasticity in certain parts of the brain, and it makes it harder to form short-term memories or recall important details when put under pressure. That said, the structure remains functionally operational. And so again, there's that high anxious, competitive, ready to knock work out type of perspective that someone has when they're in a stressed state. But when someone's experiencing burnout, that prolonged exposure shifts the brain into a state of chronic neuroinflammation. As a result, the certain cells in the brain, certain brain immune cells become chronically activated, and that actually leads to a loss in volume in certain parts of the brain overall. So again, you're seeing that lack of energy, that lack of work, that shutting down of certain systems in the brain as a result of burnout. And at the same time, there's just a fundamental neural network shift and a difference between the stressful shift and the burnout shift. When someone's experiencing chronic stress, your threat detection levels absolutely and utterly dominate. They keep you locked in fight or flight mode as you're ready to adapt and adjust to whatever might be coming your way next. But when you're experiencing deep burnout, the brain it rewards neural pathways in effectively no way. It shuts down. Those reward pathways just cease to function. Again, that reduction in functionality as a result of the brain just simply being overloaded from all the emotional processing that it's had to do. And so there's a massive difference between chronic stress and burnout as we currently understand it today. And so that said, clearly it's an issue that we as people have to find a way to manage effectively. And that said, there have been several different perspectives placed out into the social domain when it comes to thinking through burnout management. One extreme perspective prioritizes the individual's responsibility first and foremost. It sees any struggle with burnout, with the brain stopping its functionality, to be an issue that's tied directly to the individual. Whether it be a lack of discipline, a lack of routine, a lack of eating properly, a lack of getting enough sleep, whatever the issue is, that is typically the perspective held by the people who fall in this extreme number one. They say it's the individual's responsibility to understand where their current routines are failing them and to just lock it in, as the kids would say nowadays, and really just take responsibility for themselves so that they can bring a fully functioning disposition and body into the workplace so that they can continue to be productive people within their organization and within their industry. But on the other side, you have the perspective held by people in extreme two, which blames organizations and even the government at large for failing to put certain structures in place to protect workers from experiencing burnout and being put in overly pressurized situations. And so this group and this extreme would call for massive systemic reform. They want to see 4-day work weeks implemented. As an example, they would want to see more hybrid work, more remote work as an opportunity for people to balance work and life a little bit better in order to combat this burnout. And they oftentimes see organizations as being too greedy in such a way that they're trying to extract as much value from their workers as they can, rather than caring for the needs physically, mentally, spiritually of their employees so that they can come to work in a much more effective and sustainable manner. Those are the two extremes commonly held by most people who engage in the discussion of burnout management. But of course, there's a middle ground perspective that tries to pull on, quote unquote, the best of both perspectives. From extreme one, the middle ground perspective would say that there is an element of individual responsibility, but at the same time, they would also see that there is definitely a need for systemic reform. And so the recommendation that people who fall into this messy middle ground perspective might recommend would involve scaling, limiting, and exiting fundamentally as a way to tackle burnout in a balanced manner. As far as scaling is concerned, they might recommend scaling back the effort that one puts into their work from maybe 100% to maybe about 80%, 75%. Still being productive, but just not at the expense of the person's sanity. From a limiting perspective, they would recommend setting hard lines in the sand with supervisors that might definitely cause some friction. And so the middle ground perspective would recommend taking on some sort of flack or heat from your supervisor for not being as above and beyond as they might be expecting you to be, but at the same time, maintaining a certain amount of productivity to the point where you're not seen as totally without value to your organization. And then thirdly, the exit with respect to exit strategy typically looks something like planning for an eventual exit from the company and just getting all the correct pieces in place to be able to set yourself up to leave in a successful manner so that you're not experiencing a significant drop in personal or professional life and career experience. And so that's generally the messy middle ground perspective that tries to balance the quote unquote best of both extreme perspectives on this issue. Now, that said, there's a notable underlying theme in each of these three perspectives, and it's the theme of self-preservation. If you notice, each of these perspectives prioritizes self-preservation in some way. In extreme number one, toughness is definitely central to the self-preservation emphasis. You have to take responsibility for your life decisions. You have to be the one who puts the right routines in place. You have to be the one who puts the right diet in place, who gets the right amount of sleep, the right amount of exercise, so that your physical body is in the right shape for you to be able to tackle the challenges that come at you, so you don't just get crushed by the weight of whatever you end up experiencing. You have to build toughness, and toughness is a part of self-preservation in extreme one. But in extreme two, self-preservation is prioritized from a protection perspective. The people in extreme number two want corporations and the government to put the right protections in place for workers and employees. They want an appropriate work-life balance to be prioritized over the simple, quote-unquote, extraction of value from employees in the workforce for the sake of corporations earning a profit. That obviously prioritizes self-preservation in some sense. It just shifts the responsibility onto corporations and the government to make sure that individuals in the workforce are effectively given opportunities to not burn out in the first place. And so in both extremes, we clearly see self-preservation, but in the messy middle ground, you see a little bit of both. Right? The messy middle ground requires some individual action, and it requires the push for some structural or legal action as far as making change. On the toughness front, they would be proponents of reducing your input slightly and being able to set hard boundaries about that, not being pushed by your supervisor or your organization to do more than you are physically able to handle. That requires a certain amount of toughness because that will produce friction within your organization and within your department. But that said, at the same time, it wants you to be a proponent of good workplace practices to ensure that some protection could potentially happen in the future with complaints being brought up within the organization and with people in society in general holding rallies to discuss their perspectives on certain issues and present those to the public. It's in order that the society that they exist within starts dealing with the issues at a more fundamental level. And so toughness and protection are really central to all of these perspectives in some way. Toughness, obviously, mostly in extreme one, protection, mostly in extreme two, and then a balance of both in the messy middle ground. But again, self-preservation is clearly the theme that we see here. And the clear problem with pursuing self-preservation is that it simply kills your vitality. Now, why does it kill your vitality to pursue self-preservation? Well, obviously, concerns about personal sufficiency will start to arise more in your thoughts as you try to orient your disposition in either of these three perspectives. If you're thinking about the toughness perspective, obviously the concern is, am I enough? Am I doing enough to truly put myself in a position to not be crushed by the environment that I'm in? If you're thinking about the more systemic reform perspective, obviously the concern is going to be about external threats as well. But again, personal sufficiency. Am I going to be seen as valuable enough to this organization to the point that I can draw a hard line in the sand and say, I'm not going to burn myself out in order to produce work for this organization. And again, obviously, that external threat is the fact that you are not likely, if you're watching this, I'm assuming most people who are watching this are not top-level executives in an organization. If you find yourself at a lower spot in your organization, obviously the threat there is that you could be fired for drawing hard lines in the sand or reducing your practical work output. And so these worries about personal sufficiency and these external threats obviously start to arise as you start to put your own interests at the forefront of your burnout management perspective. And so unfortunately, that is not a good route to go. So the clear need here is that we need a vitality that is not only alive, but is resurrected in the most literal sense. If you've reached peak burnout, like we saw earlier with the difference between stress and burnout, if you've reached peak burnout, your body is already starting to reduce its functionality. It's starting to shut down. It's been overworked and it's starting to compensate for that. And so you're on the way down if you're in a period of burnout, which is why you not only need life, but a completely new, resurrected life, a new vitality when it comes to your work, when it comes to your engagement and your motivation to be a productive employee in whatever context that you're working within. And so that said, clearly, if we're talking about resurrection, we have to look to Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ obviously is central to the narrative of creation, as we've talked about before on this podcast. But clearly, he encapsulates the resurrection aspect of the redemption narrative. And if we look at his life, we see a very interesting balance in the life of Jesus Christ. We see someone who was conceived by the Holy Spirit, yet born of a human woman, divine, yet human, both 100% at the same time. This is the totally holy, totally supreme God of the universe veiling himself in humanity, taking on humanity, which is not inherent to his divinity. And so fundamentally, we see that at the outset of Jesus' life. But over the course of his ministry, we see someone who is seen as a reputable person, but whose reputation is also hindered by the fact that he's hanging around a lot of outcasts. He's healing the sick, even on days when he's not supposed to be, quote unquote, according to the Jewish law or the Jewish leaders' interpretation of the Jewish law. And for that, he received a ton of flack from the Jewish leaders in Israel at that point in time. But nonetheless, he was seen as that reputable teacher, as someone who could perform miracles, who could heal people. He was viewed highly and yet had a bad reputation with the people who were seen as the leaders of the land. And obviously, as we get closer to his death on the cross, before then, we have to note, obviously, that he was convicted of blasphemy by the Jews and sentenced to execution in alignment with the Jewish law for that conviction. But this is having lived a perfect life. Jesus never did anything wrong. He never violated the Jewish law, the law of God, the law that is his as the God of the universe. He never violated it once. And yet he was convicted as a violator of his own law, sentenced to death, and in the Roman Empire, hung on the cross. But 3 days later, he was raised to new life by God the Father, bodily. Obviously, his spirit didn't die. His spirit was reunited with a resurrected body. And then later, he ascended into heaven, promising to come back. And that is the hope of Christians all across the world, that Jesus Christ will come back. And at that point in time, all of God's people will be bodily resurrected. And we will spend eternity with him in a reality that is free from sin, free from suffering, free from all the things that weigh on the human disposition and on our entire humanity as well, physically and spiritually. And so in this divine example, in the person and work of Jesus Christ, clearly we see that Jesus was able to balance his reputation in a very unique way. He was able to sacrifice fundamentally taking on human flesh as the God of the universe who needs nothing and is totally self-sufficient is an absolute sacrifice. It was not necessary for him to do so. He was not confined to needing to do so. It was a willing sacrifice on his part to become a human being, to be able to relate to humanity such that he could unite humanity to himself through Jesus Christ's work by faith and grace through God in the person and work of Jesus Christ. But that said, at the same time, those who were seen as the leaders, as the superiors in that society, did not view him well. And despite that external threat, he persisted in living an upright life. And he had a reputation amongst the people for being a guy who, might not have necessarily agreed with the Jewish leaders, but whose actions just demonstrated that he was clearly providing some kind of value, not only on the material front by calming storms or healing the sick, but also on the spiritual front by being a notable teacher, someone who captivated the audiences that he taught. Jesus brought a holistic value throughout his ministry to whoever he was interacting with, despite the fact that the leaders of the society were not pleased with him. And so in this, I think the reflection for us as Christians, as we're trying to apply this perspective to our burnout perspective in the resurrection narrative, is the understanding that holistic uprightness, despite human criticism, is fundamentally important. At some point in our fight to manage our burnout, we have to understand that aligning with godly love is much more important than aligning with human fear. We have to see God above those who are our superiors, who are our supervisors in the workplace. And so this really is fundamentally what it looks like to sacrifice rather than seeking self-preservation. Sacrificing more is actually the answer to dealing with burnout as we seek to resurrect our vitality. Resurrection implies that something has died and needs to be made new. And so in doing so, we have to approach our work through a sacrificial lens, willing to take on some criticism from our supervisors, potentially in some way, but obviously by not leaving stuff on the table, not leaving value on the table, and instead providing value in other ways that don't burn us out the way our current responsibilities, our current productivity levels and inputs do. And so that really is the balance. And this is the elevated perspective that I want us to operate with and explore. Sacrifice on the productivity front cannot simply leave a hole in our value provision. We have to provide something else. And when you're thinking about the workplace as a whole, productivity is not the only thing that corporations value nowadays. Obviously, it's central to what organizations value. But positivity is also something that organizations in 21st century America value more and more each and every day. And so being a positive force in your workplace doesn't necessarily just mean being productive, getting your work done on time for the right people, etc. It also just looks like being a person who people want to work with, being a positive influence from a cultural perspective. And so we'll explore that in a little bit. But fundamentally, as we start to think about sacrificing more differently, instead of simply producing output, even at the expense of our physical and dispositional sanity and state, this is fundamentally how we begin to unpack and reframe our perspective on burnout. And so that said, when we're thinking about how to reframe our perspective on burnout, we can't just deal with burnout. We have to deal with engagement. We want people to have a validated personal identity, just like the way that Jesus sacrificed his divinity by taking on humanity and living as a person who is fully God and fully man, doing practically productive things, but also spiritually productive things. The way that we sacrifice differently and more in our workplace will be a validation of our personal identity and influence. We are going to provide meaningful value in a different way. At the same time, we're going to have a resurrected vigor. We're going to want to come to work more as a result of our shifted focus from self-preservation into self-sacrifice. We're also going to resurrect our dedication to our practical work. We're no longer going to see work, after reframing our perspective, as something that drains us physically and spiritually. We're going to see it as an outlet for us to be vessels of God's work in our lives and God's work in society as a whole. And at the same time, we're going to resurrect our value, not just in the practical output that we produce from a productivity perspective, not just in the positive contributions that we make from a cultural perspective, but also from a perspective of who we are as a person. We're going to see who we truly are in a transparent way. And that said, we have to define both sides of the coin. But we're going to start with burnout because it's the negative and it's the current issue that we're trying to address. If we were to think about this from a sort of geometric perspective, a shape-based perspective, the burnout experience typically looks something like this. When everything is going right in your workplace, you're kind of just a circle. You're rolling along, you've got good momentum, everything is kind of balanced properly. You're just rolling through your professional or occupational life just fine. But then pressure starts to pick up. It starts to weigh on your shoulders. And that pressure, since you are a circle, starts to impact your edges. It starts to make your edges more rigid, more structured as you try to put more routine in place and more discipline in place in order to be able to deal with the increased pressure and output demands. But that said, the more rigid you become, the less able to roll you are. And so you start to become more of a square, right? Certain ridges at certain places, making it hard for you to effectively roll through your work life and just making it harder for you to function in your workplace. This is where that cynicism and detachment really starts to pick up. The harder it gets for you to do your job, the harder it becomes for you to see the value in what you do and want to be attached to your work. And unfortunately, as these ridges start to form, we eventually, if we don't deal with these ridges properly, see our structure entirely collapse. And eventually we become just a flat line, literally. Not even in the medical sense, flat line, but I guess that's applicable here too. Your work vitality literally just flat lines. Now you're not even being productive anymore. You're actually hindering your company's ability to produce output and compete in the industry that they're a part of. You're becoming a practical hindrance to your organization. That's typically the third stage of burnout, is a drop in productivity. And this is where you flatline. This is typically a result, however, of not having a substance within that is able to withstand the pressure that you're experiencing. Think about the shapes that we've talked about so far, right? A circle, a square, a flat line. These are two-dimensional shapes. Right? And so you're missing a dimension here. Life is three-dimensional, as I've said before. Vertical relationships, horizontal relationships, longitudinal relationships, authority, awareness, and adaptability or adjustment, if you want to think about it that way. And so it's super important that we get a substantive shape, a shape that has something within it so that when the structure starts to collapse under pressure, it doesn't fully collapse and it's able to recover. And so fundamentally, the issue that we're having in our current two-dimensional perspective within the workplace is that we lack a meaningful presence because of our 2D perspective. We're simply going from a position of balanced approach where circumstances are as we like them to a situation where we're simply going through the motions. We're simply doing what has to be done, and we're not really being mindful of it. And when we try to be mindful of it, it just makes us that much more depressed and disappointed to the point where we detach and our practical productivity drops. That's not a position we want to be in. And so as we try to convert our perspective from a two-dimensional to a three-dimensional perspective, what we're really trying to do is get more meaningful presence. When we're three-dimensional, we have a different element present within us. We have the ability to be filled up with something that we otherwise would not be able to be when we're living two-dimensionally. We're able to move with intentionality and with a substance that better supports the structure of our disposition. And so if we're now thinking about burnout from a positive perspective, how we go from burnout to engagement again, we have to start thinking three-dimensionally. We have to take up space. We have to be an authoritative presence in our workplace in a way that people recognize our value. They recognize our identity. They recognize our influence and the full weight of it. And so that said, how do we become more engaged in the workplace if we've already hit that rock bottom of burnout? We've already hit our flat line. Well, it starts with filling our substance up. Now that we're three-dimensional, we can be filled with a substance that we couldn't be filled with when we were two-dimensional. And so the substance really that we're trying to fill ourselves up with here is seeing our work through a lens of opportunity rather than a lens of pressure. In a two-dimensional perspective, that pressure collapsed our structure. And since we had no substance within ourselves, that structure just eroded and collapsed over time. But when we're thinking about our work from an opportunistic perspective, now we're not so focused on the pressure and we're more focused on glorifying God by using our skill sets. We start to see every responsibility that we are given as an opportunity to glorify God rather than simply produce a practical outcome. And so when we do this, we're starting to fill ourselves up with this substance. And this substance is the glorification of God, the usage of our skill sets. That is the primary motivator. That is the substance that our disposition is filled with when it's three-dimensionally oriented. And so that said, when we're applying this in the workplace, it looks fundamentally different than it did before. Initially, we were focused on standardization. We wanted a predictable, lighter routine that we could simply just roll through. Standard input, standard output. That kept us happy. That drove our emotions. But now that we have a three-dimensional dispositional perspective, we're more focused on adaptability. We're more focused on rolling with the momentum of the circumstance rather than trying to set up a structure that we just blindly follow and are blindly happy with. Think about a ball, for instance. A ball is a three-dimensional object, and a ball rolls effortlessly in alignment with whatever the context is. It adapts to the momentum that it's faced with in any given circumstance. And so by becoming more adaptability focused and less standardization focused, all of a sudden we're able to better roll with the challenges that we experience. And that might not bring us happiness, but it'll bring us a lot more joy, especially if our focus now and the substance within us is God glorification oriented rather than purely productivity oriented. That's adaptability versus standardization. Three-dimensional disposition versus two-dimensional disposition when it comes to burnout and burnout management and burnout avoidance. That said, now, as we face more pressure, obviously we're not perfect as people. We're going to experience circumstances where the pressure might simply be too much. The deadline simply is too close. The work itself is simply too complex. That is pressure, and that will certainly impact the shape of our disposition. But since we're three-dimensional now, our shape no longer crumbles under the pressure. It absorbs the pressure. It temporarily deforms, but it expands back out to its original shape. Again, think of a ball or a spherical structure like that is filled with a substance. If you apply pressure to it, it deforms as long as the pressure is on. But when the pressure comes off, the shape shapes back into its original form. That said, we're no longer worried about collapse because we're not two-dimensional and we have a substance within ourselves now. And so when those seasons of pressure come, we're able to absorb that pressure. We'll genuinely acknowledge that pressure when it happens, but we know that by the end of that particular period of stress and pressure, we will return to our original shape because of the substance that we're filled with and the fact that we're not relying on that structure to keep us afloat in challenging work circumstances. And then lastly, we have to be growth oriented. If you're thinking about avoiding that flat line, that third aspect of the burnout phases, growth is super key to this. As you go through your professional experience, as you experience more challenging circumstances, those experiences genuinely sit in your disposition, right? This is why experience is an important driver of wisdom over time. Having lived through something challenging, you no longer can only relate to the challenges mentally, but also from a more feelings and emotions driven perspective. Not necessarily that the emotions or the feelings drove the way you responded in those circumstances, but you know what those emotions and feelings felt like in that circumstance. And it grew you. It grew your understanding. It grew your knowledge, and it grew your resilience. The same thing applies in our three-dimensional perspective. Rather than suffering from the emptiness of our two-dimensional perspective that eventually led to us becoming a flat line under the pressure as our structure collapsed as we were going through the motions. With our 3D perspective, these pressures actually fill our substance. We get to use more of our skill sets to glorify God. And over time, as we get a more comprehensive perspective on these experiences, we learn more. We get more in touch with what it feels like to be in certain scenarios. That grows our fundamental structure. It grows our three-dimensional shape. We have more room for more substance. And that just makes us even more of a presence within our organization, within our sector, within our industry, within our company. We become more fortified and we become better able to take on the next challenge that will come after that. Growth versus emptiness. Three-dimensional versus two-dimensional. And so this really is the shift. In summary, burnout is the result of a two-dimensional perspective on our work life. Oftentimes, we're stuck thinking about work from a perspective that is too structured, too rigid, and we seek to put ourselves in a work position that makes us happy. And when that pressure comes, that happiness goes away. Our structure starts to collapse and eventually flatlines under the weight of the pressure that we're dealing with. But when we have a three-dimensional perspective, because we're filled with the substance that comes from orienting ourselves towards the glorification of God by using our skill sets in the opportunities that we've been presented with, rather than purely seeking to produce output, what we start to see is that we're better able to adapt to the circumstances that we're a part of. We're better able to navigate those as we prioritize adaptability over that standardized happy work situation. When that pressure collapses on us, we're better able to absorb it for that temporary period of time. And then when the pressure alleviates, we're able to reshape back to our original shape. And then over time, the more pressure we experience, the more knowledge we get, the more understanding we get, the better we're able to understand our emotions and our feelings in certain circumstances of pressure. And the more we reflect on that, the more we grow so that we have a larger three-dimensional presence in our organization. But as it comes to sacrificing, how does sacrifice fit into this picture? This is fundamentally how our disposition is shaped and how we can perceive our work differently and the way we go about it differently. But where is the room for sacrificing more? Well, obviously, that reduction in work is a part of the messy middle ground perspective. But like I said earlier, the reduction in work can't simply be it. You can't reduce the value that you provide in your workplace. So where do you account for that value elsewhere? Through being a positive influence in your workplace culture. And the way you do this is not necessarily by trying to get all goody-goody with your supervisor. It looks like getting to know the people around you. Remember, think back to the example of Jesus' ministry. He hung around with the people that were oftentimes seen as outcasts, who are at the lower level of the social spectrum, so to speak, who the leaders of the society often looked down upon or looked upon as people who just simply were not as good as they were. These are the people that Jesus hung around. And so you don't have to have a good relationship necessarily with your supervisors in order to provide value to your organization. Obviously, lower level members of your organization are important contributors to the work that your organization does. And so by redirecting some of this energy spent on productivity towards being a positive cultural influence, you're better able to improve the morale of your department, depending on the size of your organization, maybe the morale of your organization as well. But this looks like really truly getting to understand your coworkers, getting to know them, being friendly with them, going above and beyond in that way too. When someone walks down the corridor, instead of just focusing on whatever you're working on, just acknowledge them. Say, hey, how's it going? It's good to see you. Something very simple. People are very easy to please. And sometimes all a person needs in order to be a positive influence in their specific context is that little bit of encouragement or recognition. Seeing people as people and not simply seeing them as productivity machines. That is the primary way that you can practically produce a more positive value within your workplace if you do choose to scale back on some of your productivity to maintain your practical sanity and physical health. That's one of the ways to do it. That's probably the best way to do it, because in doing that, you get to learn about other people. You get to understand how they process life. What do they value in life? Do they value work above all else? Are they struggling with burnout? Do they value life maybe above their work, their family, their extended family, their friendships, everything outside of work? Where is their emphasis? You get to know more about the people you work with so you can better relate to them as well. And when you're working on things with them, that improves your ability to get things done more effectively as well. And so this really is central to the sacrifice more differently aspect that has kind of been the underlying theme of our reframing of burnout. We're not sacrificing more from a practical productivity perspective. We're sacrificing more from a positivity perspective within the organization's culture, which actually ends up having an effect on productivity at the end of the day. This is super important. And if there's no other takeaway you get from this episode, that is probably the main one I want you to get. In order to effectively tackle burnout, we're shifting our disposition off of self-preservation and onto self-sacrifice. And this self-sacrifice looks more like getting to know the people I work with, particularly in a similar level of the organization that I work within, which actually ends up improving productivity at the end of the day, which makes everyone happy a lot more than they would be in an alternative situation. So that said, here are 28 questions that I have for you as you consider how to effectively manage burnout in your own life and evaluate your current ability to do so within the general sacrificial theme that we've been dealing with so far. And if you're struggling with any of these, obviously you can drop a comment in the comment section. I would love to respond and engage with you. But otherwise, I would encourage you to have these conversations and discuss these questions with anyone in your life who you are close with. And most importantly, to take these issues before God in prayer and to get into the Bible to see how people dealt with high stress, high pressure situations as they lived out God's calling for their lives. So that said, here are those 28 questions that we will end today's episode with. Question number 1, presence. Are you consciously observing the high quality and detailed impact of your work as you produce it? Or are you sacrificing your present awareness by blurring through tasks just to keep up a positive, productive facade? Question 2, action. Are you making intentional choices to dedicate energy where it creates true value? Or are you relying on a reflexive script that demands you stay constantly busy and upbeat, regardless of the cost? Question number 3, flexibility. Can you easily adapt to your output targets when unexpected challenges arise? Or does any disruption to your planned productivity cause you to sacrifice rest to keep up appearances? Question number 4, self-observation. Are you tracking your internal energy levels with realistic self-awareness? Or are you dismissing your personal fatigue as insignificant compared to your drive to produce and stay positive? Question number 5, initiation. Are you taking deliberate first steps to build sustainable work habits? Or are you passively waiting for workload pressure to drop before taking care of your well-being? Question number 6, resistance. Are you actively resisting the short-term comfort of toxic positivity, pretending everything is fine, in order to do the longer, harder work of building true resilience? Question number 7, momentum. Are you actively steering your projects towards meaningful goals, or are you letting the momentum of relentless task completion drift you straight into exhaustion? Question number 8, ownership. Are you taking ownership of both the effort you invest and the energy recovery you require, or are your ideas for a balanced work life remaining unexecuted? Question number 9, boundaries. Do you listen to the initial disquiet when taking on a high-demand project, or do you sacrifice your early peace to say yes cheerfully, only to scramble to protect your sanity later? Question number 10, accountability. Are you taking personal responsibility for setting limits that protect your output and optimism, or are you blaming external demands for forcing you to work past your limits? Question number 11, endurance. Are you willing to endure the short-term awkwardness of setting realistic expectations, or do you sacrifice your personal capacity to secure status, praise, or professional gain? Question number 12, clarity. Can you state what you can realistically deliver with clarity and confidence, or do you overcomplicate your comments to avoid giving a firm no? Question number 13, insight. When you get a sudden, clear realization that your current pace is unsustainable, do you act on it immediately, or do you dissect it until you convince yourself you can squeeze out a little more work? Question number 14, physiology. When your body sends clear signals, physical signals of strain, do you adjust your workload immediately, or do you dismiss those signals so that you can keep executing with a smile? Question number 15, fluidity. Can you adapt your daily output to match your current capacity, or are you forcing yourself into a high, rigid model of peak performance every single day? Question 16, trust. When deciding to take on a demanding goal, can you clearly articulate how it preserves both performance and well-being, or are you relying on a vague belief that it will all work out? Question number 17, grounding. Are you evaluating your output based on objective facts about what is realistic, or are you tied to a rigid standard that measures self-worth purely by output? Question number 18, curiosity. Are you willing to test whether scaling back slightly actually improves your work quality and outlook, or do you selectively focus on metrics that justify continuous overwork? Question 19, consistency. Have you created a consistent, structured schedule that supports both high output and genuine renewal, or do you rely on temporary bursts of enthusiasm that leave you depleted? Question number 20, humility. Are you humble enough to acknowledge your human operational limits, or do you operate as if you are immune to the physical and mental drag of burnout? Question number 21, emotion. Are you allowing yourself to process genuine frustration or fatigue, or are you suppressing those feelings behind a wall of forced neutrality and optimism? Question number 22, value. Are you actively investing energy into work and habits that bring true fulfillment, or are you sacrificing your personal values until productivity becomes detached, cynical, and a chore? Question number 23, vulnerability. Vulnerability. Bleh. Are you willing to risk showing your team or peers that you have limits? Or do you hide behind performative hyper-productivity to protect your image? Question number 24, physiology. Are you attuned to how your mental energy, physical health, and work output interact as one system, or are you disconnected from your body while pushing through the workday? Question number 25, coherence. Do your daily work habits and positive attitude reflect your true personal values, or is there a gap between what you care about and how much you sacrifice for your role? Question number 26, narrative. Is your drive to achieve a genuine extension of your personal growth journey, or are you performing a scripted role of the tireless high achiever? Question number 27, authenticity. Is the enthusiasm you bring to your projects a legitimate expression of engagement or a hollow mask used to hide growing exhaustion? Question number 28, delineation. Can you distinguish between your personal choice to strive for excellence and the external pressures pushing you towards self-sacrificing overwork? These are the 28 questions I hope you sincerely consider and discuss with those who are close to you and take before God in prayer so that He can continue to revitalize your disposition in alignment with self-sacrifice in different ways as opposed to self-preservation from a purely productivity-oriented perspective. That said, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I hope you learned something that you did not know coming into today. If you are not subscribed to this podcast already, I highly encourage you to do so. I do these walkthroughs once a week, and if you found value in it, I hope that you would support the channel in that way by subscribing, liking this content. Well, maybe if there's a comment in there, you should like it as well. And then obviously sharing it with anyone that you think might find it applicable and relevant to their life. But until next week's episode, I pray that you have a fantastic week. Take care. God bless. And always be vital.